307 Americans dead, 1 aircraft carrier on the bottom of the Pacific, 150 planes lost. It was the greatest naval victory in American history, and on a desk in Pearl Harbor in the summer of 1942, a 57-year-old admiral with blue eyes and a quiet voice was holding a list of officers who had made it possible, alongside the names of officers whose mistakes had nearly cost him the battle. Washington wanted those names, the newspapers wanted those names, the families of the dead wanted those names. Admiral Chester William Nimitz had every right to give them up. He had the authority, he had the evidence, he had the political cover. The Navy expected him to do what every commander after every great battle has been expected to do. Find someone to blame. He refused. This is the story of why a quiet man from Texas became the only American admiral in the Second World War to win the greatest naval battle in his country's history, and refused to punish a single one of the men who had nearly lost it for him. It begins 6 months earlier, 2 floors beneath the supply office at Pearl Harbor, in a windowless basement called the Dungeon, where a 42-year-old commander in a maroon bathrobe and bedroom slippers is bent over a chart, drawing a circle around an island most Americans have never heard of. His name is Joseph Rochefort. He has not slept in his own bed in weeks, he has not seen the sun in days. And in the next 16 hours he is going to tell Chester Nimitz something Washington has spent nearly 6 months refusing to believe. The Japanese are coming, their target is Midway, he is going to be right, and it will destroy his career. May 1942, nearly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the United States Pacific Fleet is a corpse with a pulse. Battleships sit on the harbor floor in oily silhouettes. On bad days, the smell of burned fuel still drifts off the water. 8 battleships sunk or crippled, 188 aircraft destroyed, another 159 damaged. 2,403 Americans dead. The Imperial Japanese Navy is now the strongest naval force on Earth, and it is not finished. The Philippines have fallen, Guam, Wake Island, Singapore, Hong Kong, the Dutch East Indies. Japanese carriers have raided Ceylon, sunk a British carrier in open water, and pushed deeper into the Central Pacific than any fleet in history. The same 4 flat tops that destroyed Pearl Harbor, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, are still at sea, still hunting. And nobody in Washington knows where they are going next. On December 31st, 1941, 3 weeks after the harbor burned, a new commander arrived at Pearl in a 4-engine flying boat. He wore the white uniform of a vice admiral. He had blue eyes that seemed to look through people instead of at them. He was 56 years old. His name was Chester William Nimitz. There was no ceremony at the dock, no band, no parade. The harbor was still a graveyard, and a graveyard does not host parades, so they held the change of command on the deck of a submarine, the USS Grayling, because there were no battleships left to stand on. Nimitz read his orders out loud. The previous commander's flag came down. He saluted. And just like that, the man who would be responsible for winning the Pacific War took the job nobody else wanted. He inherited a fleet that had lost, a staff that was terrified, and a code-breaking unit 2 floors below ground run by a 42-year-old commander everyone said was strange. Rochefort had been in this fight long before the fight began. In the 1920s, while other naval officers were learning to drive battleships, he had quietly become one of only 3 Americans fluent in Japanese, cryptanalysis, and naval operations at the same time. He had studied in Tokyo. He had run code units in Washington. He understood the enemy's mind better than most Americans understood their own. Now he ran Station Hypo, the basement they called the Dungeon. His team was small. Thomas Dyer, the cryptanalyst who would not stop until the mathematics broke. Joseph Finnegan, the linguist who could read intent into a single Japanese character. Donald Showers, 23 years old, the youngest officer in the unit. They worked in 18-hour shifts. They slept on cots between the file cabinets. They ate sandwiches off the codebook desks. Their families wrote letters they did not answer. They were trying to break a Japanese naval cipher called JN-25. They had broken about 15% of it. 15% was enough. In early May, the intercepts began to change. Movement orders, fuel allocations, transport schedules, carrier divisions reassigned across the Pacific Theater. The outline of something enormous was forming in the radio traffic, an operation the Japanese called AF. Rochefort believed AF was Midway. Midway is an atoll in the Central Pacific, two small islands of coral and bird droppings, 1,200 miles northwest of Honolulu. It has an airstrip, a radar station, a garrison of Marines, and if Japan took it, they would have a base from which to threaten Hawaii itself. Rochefort took his analysis up the chain. Nimitz listened. But 4,000 miles away in Washington, another team was reading the same intercepts and reaching a very different conclusion. Station Nejige, the Office of Naval Communications. Captain John Redman ran the section called OP-20G. His older brother, Rear Admiral Joseph Redman, sat one floor above as the Director of Naval Communications. Together, the Redman brothers controlled the institutional voice of American naval intelligence. They had ambition, they had access, and they had been embarrassed. In the months leading up to Pearl Harbor, Washington's codebreakers had missed the warning signs. Rochefort had missed them too. Everyone had missed them, but after the disaster, the Redmans had quietly begun maneuvering to consolidate all naval code-breaking under their own command, in Washington, under their control. Rochefort was the obstacle, so when Rochefort said the target was Midway, the Redmans said the target was elsewhere. The Aleutians, perhaps? The West Coast, maybe Hawaii itself. They wrote memos, they called meetings, they worked phones. They told Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, Chief of Naval Operations, the second most powerful military officer in America, that the man in the bathrobe at Pearl Harbor could not be trusted. Ernest King was 63 years old. He drank. He did not smile. His own daughter once said her father was the most even-tempered man in the Navy. He was always in a rage. King believed the Redmans. He told Nimitz to prepare for a Japanese attack somewhere other than Midway. Chester Nimitz did something almost no four-star officer in American history has ever done. He ignored his own headquarters. He did not write a defiant letter. He did not call a press conference. He did not pick a fight he could not win. He simply began moving ships toward Midway. He ordered Enterprise and Hornet, recalled from the South Pacific. He ordered Yorktown, damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea, requiring an estimated 90 days of repair, patched in 72 hours and sent back to sea. Welders worked through the night with the ship still leaking. Sailors slept on the deck plates between shifts. When his intelligence officer brought him Rochefort's final assessment, Nimitz read it carefully. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton was 39. He had spent 3 years in Tokyo before the war. He had personally known Admiral Yamamoto. When Layton said Rochefort was right, Nimitz believed him, but belief was not proof, and Nimitz needed something he could put on Admiral King's desk. The trick was elegant. The garrison at Midway was instructed to send a radio message, uncoded, in the open, on a frequency the Japanese were known to monitor. The message reported that Midway's water distillation plant had broken down. The island was running short of fresh water. Could Pearl Harbor please dispatch a tanker as soon as possible? The distillation plant was working fine. Within 24 hours, a Japanese transmission was intercepted by Station Hippo. The transmission noted, in routine logistical language, that the operational objective AF was experiencing fresh water shortages and that supply ships should be prepared accordingly. Rochefort did not celebrate. He did not smile. He walked the intercept down the corridor and laid it on Nimitz's desk. AF was Midway. The trap was set. There was one more problem. Vice Admiral William Halsey was Nimitz's best carrier commander. Aggressive, loved by his pilots, the man who had escorted the Doolittle raid against Tokyo only weeks before. He was the obvious choice to lead the American carriers into the Midway ambush. He was also in a hospital bed at Pearl Harbor, covered in oozing welts, scratching himself raw in his sleep. The diagnosis was severe dermatitis. A stress-induced skin condition had reduced one of the most famous fighting admirals in the United States Navy to a man who could not wear a uniform without bleeding through it. Halsey could not sail. Halsey was asked who should replace him. He gave one name, Raymond Ames Spruance, 55 years old. Quiet, disciplined, almost cold. A cruiser commander with no carrier combat experience whatsoever. He read philosophy in his off hours. He took long walks alone. He had served under Halsey for years and was by temperament the precise opposite of Halsey in every way. Nimitz accepted the recommendation without argument. overall tactical command would go to Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, 57, the man who had just lost the carrier Lexington at the Battle of the Coral Sea 3 weeks earlier. Admiral King wanted Fletcher relieved. King did not believe in commanders who lost ships. On May 29, 1942, Nimitz wrote King a single sentence. He is an excellent seagoing fighting naval officer. King did not write back. Fletcher kept the command. The orders Nimitz drafted next would be studied for the next 80 years. He called them Operation Plan 2942. The key phrase buried in the body of the document was 3 words: calculated risk. Fletcher and Spruance were not to engage the Japanese in a stand-up fight. They were to ambush. They were to inflict maximum damage on the Japanese carriers, and they were to break off the moment the odds turned against them. The Pacific Fleet could not afford to lose 3 more flat tops. There would be no 4th. The rendezvous point was 325 nautical miles northeast of Midway, a patch of empty ocean nobody had ever named. Nimitz named it Point Luck. It was not a name chosen lightly. On June 2, 1942, the 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the patched and bleeding Yorktown, slipped into position at Point Luck and went silent. No radio, no running lights, no smoke. 3 ships hiding in the curve of the Pacific. 2 days west, 4 Japanese carriers were steaming toward them through fog. Aboard the flagship Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, 55, conservative, methodical, the man who had broken Pearl Harbor, was reading reports that confirmed his belief that the American carriers were still in the South Pacific. There would be no resistance at Midway. The garrison would be bombed at dawn. The island would be his by sunset. He was a careful man. He was a thorough man. He was about to walk into the most one-sided ambush in the history of naval warfare. And at 4:30 on the morning of June 4th, the most decorated officers in the United States Navy were about to make so many mistakes that the only reason any of them kept their careers, the only reason any of them lived to fight again, was that one man, a 57-year-old admiral with kind eyes and a quiet voice, who had once run a destroyer aground in the Philippines and been forgiven for it, had decided long ago that he would never punish a subordinate for trying. That story is coming. But first, the dawn, 4:30 in the morning, June 4th, 1942. The Pacific is black and cold. 250 miles northwest of Midway Atoll, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers turn into the wind in perfect formation. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. Their flight decks are lit by red lamps. Their crews move in silence. Every man on every deck knows what comes next. At 0430 local time, the first Zero fighter rolls down the deck of Akagi and lifts into the dark. By 0437, 108 aircraft are airborne. 36 Zero fighters, 36 dive bombers, 36 attack planes. They form up above the fleet. They turn southeast. They fly toward Midway through a layer of cloud the morning sun has not yet touched. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo watches them go from the flag bridge of Akagi. He is wearing his white dress gloves. He is sipping green tea. He has every reason to believe this will be the easiest morning of his command. He is wrong. 220 miles to the east, at Point Luck, the carrier Enterprise has been steaming in a darkened circle since midnight. Her flight deck is crowded with aircraft. Her pilots are eating sandwiches in the ready rooms. They have been told the Japanese are coming. They have not been told when. In Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz sits in his command center wearing a pressed khaki shirt. The coffee on his desk has gone cold. Beside him stands Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton. Layton has a slip of paper in his hand. His prediction, written the night before, bearing 325 degrees, distance 175 miles, time of first contact, around 6 o'clock. At 0534, an American PBY Catalina flying boat radios in. Many planes heading Midway, bearing 320, distance 180 miles. Nimitz turns to Layton. He does not smile. He says 4 words, 5 minutes, 5 degrees, 5 miles. It is the closest a piece of military intelligence has ever come to perfection. The trap closes. By 6 o'clock, Japanese bombs are falling on Midway. The garrison fights back with everything it has. Anti-aircraft batteries, obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters that the Zeros sweep from the sky like leaves. Within 25 minutes, Midway is burning end to end. the hangars, the fuel storage, the water tower, but the airstrip, the prize, is somehow still intact. The Japanese strike leader radios a single message back to Nagumo. Second strike necessary, 15 Japanese characters. That message will end the Imperial Japanese Navy as a strategic force. Nagumo has been holding 93 reserve aircraft on his decks, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs in case American carriers appeared. Doctrine is rigid, doctrine is clear. You always keep a reserve strike ready for ships, but the American carriers, he believes, are still in the South Pacific. They are not here, they cannot be here, so at 0715 he gives the order, rearm the reserve, switch the torpedoes for fragmentation bombs. Prepare to hit Midway again. Mechanics run across 4 flight decks, pulling torpedoes off airframes by hand. They leave the weapons lying on the hangar floors. There is no time to lower them back to the magazines. Ordnance carts pile up below decks in stacks. Fuel lines are charged. The hangar bays of 4 Japanese carriers fill with armed and fueled aircraft and unsecured ordnance, a powder magazine waiting for a spark. 10 minutes later, a Japanese scout plane that should have launched on time but did not, because of a catapult malfunction, sends the message Nagumo did not want to hear. Sighted what appear to be 10 enemy surface ships, he has armed his reserve for the wrong target, while Nagumo agonizes the Americans' launch. USS Hornet goes first. Her air group commander is a 43-year-old officer named Stanhope Cottonring, a Naval Academy graduate. A competent administrator, respected by his superiors, he has never led men into combat in his life. His commanding officer is Captain Mark Andrew Mitchell, 55 years old, a pioneer of naval aviation, the man who launched Doolittle's bombers against Tokyo only 6 weeks before. Mitchell will go on to become one of the most celebrated carrier commanders of the entire war. On the morning of June 4, 1942, he and Ring are about to commit the single most devastating mistake any American officer makes at Midway. The contact report has placed the Japanese fleet roughly southwest of the American position, bearing 240 degrees. Pilots in the ready rooms have plotted the course themselves. They have marked it on their charts. They know where to fly. When Ring takes off, he turns his squadrons west, 265 degrees, a 25-degree error. In open ocean, 25 degrees is the difference between finding the enemy and disappearing forever. The pilots try to tell him. Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron, leading the 15 Devastators of Torpedo Squadron 8, breaks radio silence to argue. Waldron is 41 years old. He is of Sioux descent. He has a wife and 2 daughters at home in South Dakota. He has spent his entire adult life studying naval combat, and the night before this mission he sat at the wardroom table and wrote a letter to every pilot in his squadron. The letter contained a single line that mattered. If there is only one plane left to make a final run, I want that man to go in and get a hit. May God be with us all. Now, 2,000 feet above the Pacific, Waldron and Ring argue by hand signals across the gap between their aircraft. Ring will not turn, Waldron will not follow. Then Waldron pulls his 15 Devastators out of formation and dives. He turns southwest. He flies alone. The rest of the Hornet Air Group, bombers and fighters and Ring himself, keep flying west. Into empty ocean, hour after hour. The fighters, 10 Grumman Wildcats, run out of fuel and ditch in the sea. One pilot is lost. The dive bombers eventually give up. Some return to Hornet, some divert to Midway. None of them see a single Japanese ship. It will be remembered as the flight to nowhere, the most powerful weapon in the United States Pacific Fleet, taken out of the battle by one wrong heading on the most important morning of the war. Waldron flies his Devastators southwest at low altitude. He does not know what he will find. He has no fighter escort. He has no dive bombers to draw off the enemy combat air patrol. He is flying obsolete torpedo planes that cannot exceed 100 miles per hour at attack speed. He is carrying torpedoes, the Mark 13, known to malfunction more often than they work. He finds the Japanese fleet at 0920. The Zeros see him first. 40 fighters drop to meet him, 40 against 15. The Devastators come in low, in 2 columns, throttles wide open, trying to close the distance to drop range. The Zeros come down on them in pairs. They open fire from astern. The first Devastator bursts apart in mid-air. The second hits the water in flames, the third, the fourth, the fifth, one by one, like a man tearing pages from a book and feeding them into a fire. Waldron's plane is hit 50 feet above the waves. Witnesses say he is standing up in the cockpit, fighting his crippled aircraft toward a target when the cockpit erupts. His Devastator cartwheels into the sea. Of 15 aircraft, every single one is shot down. Of 30 crewmen, only one survives. His name is Ensign George Henrique, Jr. He is 25 years old, from Waco, Texas. He has been in the Navy for 2 years. His plane is the last to fall. He bails out at low altitude, wounded in the arm and the leg, and manages to inflate one half of his Mae West life vest before Zero strafes the water around him. He pulls a black seat cushion over his head and lies perfectly still. For the next 30 hours, George Gay floats in the Central Pacific and watches the Battle of Midway unfold around him. He watches ships burn. He watches aircraft fall from the sky. He watches 4 of the most powerful warships in the world die one by one across the long afternoon. He is the only American who sees the whole battle from sea level, but Waldron's sacrifice is not finished. 40 miles behind him, Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise is bearing down on the Japanese fleet. 14 Devastators led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, who had crashed 3 weeks earlier in a landing accident and is flying with cracked ribs and a back brace under his flight suit. The Zeros that killed Waldron are still down on the deck, low on ammunition, low on fuel. They climb to meet Lindsay anyway. 10 of 14 Devastators are shot down. Lindsay is among the dead. Behind Lindsay comes Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown. 12 Devastators led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey. By the time Massey reaches the Japanese fleet, the Zeros have been climbing and diving for nearly an hour. They are burning fuel they do not have. 10 of Massey's 12 aircraft are shot down. Massey is killed leading his men in. 41 Devastators take off from American carriers that morning. 35 do not come back. Not a single American torpedo strikes a Japanese ship. Not one. And yet, at the precise moment American torpedo squadrons are dying, every Japanese fighter on combat air patrol is at wave-top altitude. Every Zero is low on fuel. Every Zero is low on ammunition. Every Japanese anti-aircraft gunner is looking down at the water. Nobody is looking up. 2 miles above the burning Devastators of John Waldron and Eugene Lindsay and Lance Massey, 32 American dive bombers are arriving. They almost did not. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey is 40 years old. He leads the Enterprise Air Group. 32 SPD Dauntless dive bombers, each carrying a single 1,000-pound bomb. He has reached the briefed intercept point and found empty ocean. The Japanese are not there. They turned north earlier that morning, outside the original calculation. McCluskey is running out of fuel. He has a choice: return to Enterprise and report no contact, or keep searching with fuel he no longer has. He keeps flying. He flies an expanding box pattern, northwest, north, northeast. The minutes pass. The fuel gauges creep toward empty. His pilots glance at him through their cockpits, waiting for the order to turn back. The order does not come. Then, at 0955, McCluskey sees a single white wake on the surface of the empty ocean. It is the Japanese destroyer Arashi. She has broken off from the main fleet to depth charge the American submarine USS Nautilus. She is now running north at flank speed to rejoin her carriers. McCluskey does not order an attack. He banks his squadron in behind her. He follows her. For the next 25 minutes, the Arashi leads him directly to the heart of the Imperial Japanese Navy. At 10:22 he sees them, 4 flight decks below, sun on metal, the red discs of Japanese aircraft lined up wing to wing on Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. The largest concentration of naval air power on Earth, sitting in a perfect rectangle in the morning light. He keys his radio. He says 2 words: attack, attack. The dive bombers nose over. What happened in the next 10 minutes is sometimes called the 5 minutes that changed the world. Modern historians, working from the Japanese records, have shown the strike actually took closer to 10. The exact arithmetic will be argued for as long as men study naval war. But the result is not in dispute. The dive bombers come down from 20,000 feet. They come down vertical. They come down at 400 miles per hour. The Japanese see them too late. The combat air patrol is still climbing back to altitude from the torpedo plane slaughter. The anti-aircraft gunners are facing the wrong way. The first 1,000-pound bomb hits Kaga Square on her flight deck and ignites the fueled and armed aircraft sitting in her hangar bays. The second bomb hits, the third, the fourth. Kaga's hangar deck becomes a chain of secondary explosions, torpedoes cooking off below, aviation fuel running like a river of fire across the steel. Akagi is struck once, one bomb. One hit, it is enough. The bomb penetrates her flight deck, detonates in the upper hangar, and the same chain reaction begins. Within 10 minutes, Nagumo's flagship is uncontrollable. The flag officer himself has to be physically pulled off the bridge through a broken porthole because the ladders are on fire. Soryu takes 3 bombs from the Yorktown dive bombers led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie. Within 20 minutes she's dead in the water, abandoned, burning end to end. 3 Japanese fleet carriers, 3 of the 4 that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, killed in the time it takes a man to drink a cup of coffee. But the 4th is still alive. Hiryu had been separated from the main formation that morning. The American dive bombers had not seen her. While Akagi and Kaga and Soryu burned on the horizon behind her, Hiryu launched what she had, 18 dive bombers and 10 torpedo planes, toward the American carriers. They found Yorktown first. At noon, Hiryu's bombs began falling on the patched and bleeding carrier that should have been in dry dock for 90 days. 3 direct hits, fires in the engineering spaces, boilers shut down, the ship dead in the water. The crew fought the fires for 2 hours and brought her back to 15 knots. Then Hiryu's second strike arrived, the torpedo planes. 2 torpedoes struck her port side. Yorktown listed sharply. The order came to abandon ship. That afternoon, 24 dive bombers from Enterprise, including pilots who had launched from Yorktown that morning and had no ship to land on, found Hiryu alone. 4 bombs hit her flight deck. By nightfall she was a burning hulk. Her own destroyers scuttled her at dawn on June 5th. 4 Japanese carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, gone, but the killing was not finished. On June 6th, a Japanese submarine, I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, found the crippled Yorktown under tow, surrounded by destroyers, with the destroyer USS Hammond tied alongside her providing power for the salvage crews trying to save her. Tanabe fired 4 torpedoes from less than 2,000 yards. 1 missed, 1 struck Yorktown's starboard side. The other 2 passed beneath the carrier and struck Hammond. USS Hammond was a Sims-class destroyer. She had a peacetime complement of 190 men, expanded to over 200 in wartime. The 2 torpedoes broke her keel in 2 places. She sank in 4 minutes. 81 of her men were killed. Many of them survived the sinking only to die in the water when Hammond's own depth charges, which had not been safed in time, detonated below them. The bodies came up after the ship was gone. Yorktown stayed afloat through the night. Her crew watched her from the rescue ships, a column of smoke rising against the stars. She rolled over and sank at 0501 on the morning of June 7, 1942. The Battle of Midway was over. 4 Japanese carriers sunk, the same 4 that had attacked Pearl Harbor. The strategic balance of the entire Pacific had shifted in 72 hours. The cost on the American side was 1 carrier, Yorktown, 1 destroyer, Hammond, 150 aircraft, 307 Americans dead. It was the greatest naval victory in American history, and buried inside it was a catalogue of mistakes that should have ended careers. Stanhope Ring's flight to nowhere had wasted the most powerful air group in the United States Navy at the moment it was needed most. His own pilots would talk about it in lowered voices for the rest of their lives. Some would never forgive him. Mark Mitcher, captain of Hornet, would file an after-action report that quietly omitted the worst of what had happened in his air group. Researchers working through the records decades later would conclude that the official Hornet account was, at best, misleading. Miles Browning, the 46-year-old chief of staff to Raymond Spruance, had given pilots faulty fuel calculations and worse departure instructions. Many of the men who ditched in the Pacific that morning ditched because of his orders. Frank Jack Fletcher had now lost 2 carriers in 5 weeks. Critics in Washington would say he had been cautious, timid, low. Spruance himself had broken off the pursuit on the night of June 4th, declining to chase the surviving Japanese ships into what might have been a night surface action with Japanese battleships. Halsey, the whispers said. Halsey would not have stopped. Every one of these failures had a name: Ring, Mitcher, Browning, Fletcher, Spruance, and Washington wanted those names. In the days after Midway, while the smoke was still rising from the bones of 4 Japanese carriers, the United States Navy began doing what every bureaucracy does after a victory. It started looking for someone to blame. The Office of Naval Communications moved first. Captain John Redman, the man who had been wrong about Midway, the man who had told Admiral Ernest King that Joseph Rochefort could not be trusted, began circulating an internal account that quietly placed Washington at the center of the intelligence success. Station Hipo's contribution, the memos suggested, had been one element among many. Station Negat had been instrumental. The Redman brothers had been instrumental. The truth was the exact opposite. Joseph Rochefort had been right. Washington had been wrong. The water trick had been Rochefort's. The AF identification had been Rochefort's. The location, the timing, the assessment of Japanese intentions, every piece of it had come out of the windowless basement at Pearl Harbor. But Joseph Rochefort was a 42-year-old commander in a bathrobe. The Redmans were Washington. In late June 1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz signed a formal recommendation for the Distinguished Service Medal, the Navy's highest non-combat decoration. The citation said that Commander Joseph John Rochefort, more than any other officer, had made the victory at Midway possible. The recommendation went up the chain. It landed on the desk of Admiral Ernest King. King vetoed it. He gave no public explanation. He gave no internal one either. The men who worked closely with him in those weeks would later say only this: to give Rochefort the medal would be to admit that Washington had been wrong, that the Office of Naval Communications had failed, that Captain John Redman and his brother had advised the second most powerful officer in the United States Navy to prepare for an attack at the wrong place. That was not going to happen. The medal was denied, and quietly, in an office 4,000 miles from the basement where the war had been won, the United States Navy began making arrangements to take Joseph Rochefort out of the only job he had ever truly cared about. He did not yet know. Chester Nimitz did. The battle for credit had begun, and Nimitz, 57 years old, with kind eyes and a quiet voice, was about to discover that he could not save the man who had saved the Pacific Fleet. But he could save the men who had nearly lost it. That was the choice he made. That was the choice that defined him. That is the story still to come. November 1942. 5 months after Midway, Joseph Rochefort sits at a desk in San Francisco. The desk is in the office of the commander of a floating dry dock. The dry dock is anchored in the bay. It is used to repair the hulls of merchant ships and damaged auxiliaries. It does not break codes. It does not change wars. The transfer orders had arrived in October. They were polite. They were routine. They thanked Commander Rochefort for his service at Station Hypo and assigned him to his new duties in California. They mentioned no reason. They needed none. He read them twice. He folded them in half. He went to his office in the dungeon, took down the cardboard sign that hung above his desk, and put it in his briefcase. The sign read, "We can accomplish anything in this world, provided no one cares who gets the credit." It would hang above every desk he ever worked at for the rest of his life. He never complained. Not in 1942. Not in 1972. Not once. Not to anyone. He simply left. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz read the transfer order with the same expressionless face he wore for everything. He had fought for the medal and lost. He had appealed to King and been overruled. The institutional machinery of the United States Navy had decided, 4,000 miles from the war, that Joseph Rochefort had to be silenced. Not because he had failed. Because he had succeeded when Washington said he would not. Nimitz could not stop it. But there was something he could still do. The reports from Midway had been arriving on his desk for weeks. The after-action accounts, the squadron logs, the casualty lists, the full record of every mistake every officer had made on the 4th of June. He had read them all. He knew about the flight to nowhere. He knew about Mitcher's misleading report. He knew about Browning's bad fuel calculations. He knew about Fletcher, and the decisions Halsey might not have made. He knew about every officer that Washington wanted his head on a platter for. He sat with those reports for a long time. Then he picked up a pen. What he wrote next was the most consequential document no one remembers. To understand why Chester Nimitz wrote what he wrote, you have to go back 34 years. July 7th, 1908, Batangas Bay, the Philippines. A 23-year-old Naval Academy graduate named Chester William Nimitz is in command of his first ship, the USS Decatur, an aging destroyer of the Bainbridge class. He has the deck, he has the chart, he has the responsibility. What he does not have on this particular night is a current chart of Batangas Harbor. The Decatur runs aground on a mud bank in the dark. The grounding is not catastrophic, no one is hurt. The ship is refloated within hours, but the United States Navy of 1908 does not forgive these things. A court of inquiry is convened. Ensign Nimitz is charged with neglect of duty. He is found guilty. His career, by every reasonable measure, should be over. It is not. The Admiral signing his official record adds a single sentence at the bottom of the page, 7 words. This is a good officer and will take more care in the future. That sentence saves Chester Nimitz. He goes on to command submarines, to command a battleship division, to shape the doctrine of underway replenishment that will keep American fleets at sea for years at a time. To become, in December 1941, the man who is handed the smoking ruins of the Pacific Fleet and told to win the war with what's left. He never forgets the 7 words. He never forgets what a second chance feels like. And when the reports from Midway pile up on his desk in the summer of 1942, and Washington demands names, and the cameras want a villain, and the bureaucracy is hungry for someone to punish for the parts that went wrong, Chester Nimitz makes a choice. He chooses to be the admiral who wrote the 7 words. His official after-action report on the Battle of Midway is a remarkable document. Not for what it says, for what it does not. It does not name Stanhope Ring. It does not name Mark Mitcher. It does not name Miles Browning. It does not criticize Frank Jack Fletcher. It does not second-guess Raymond Spruance. It attributes the mistakes of June 4th to the inherent chaos of multi-carrier combat, to the limitations of 1942 radio communications, to the friction for war that Karl von Clausewitz had written about 100 years earlier. It frames every error as an institutional lesson, a problem to be solved by training and equipment in the next battle, not a sin to be punished in this one. It is not a whitewash. The mistakes are documented, the losses are counted, the lessons are drawn, but the men who made the mistakes are left standing. Years later, asked why he had done it that way, Nimitz wrote a single sentence that has been quoted in every naval leadership manual published since. The attributes of loyalty, discipline, and devotion to duty on the part of subordinates must be matched by patience, tolerance, and understanding on the part of superiors. It was not a platitude, it was a combat doctrine. The men he protected went on to change the Pacific War. Raymond Spruance became Nimitz's chief of staff, then commander of the 5th Fleet. He led the campaigns through the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, the Philippine Sea. Many serious historians of the United States Navy consider Raymond Spruance the finest combat admiral the country ever produced. He was the quiet man who had broken off the pursuit on the night of June 4th, the man Halsey supposedly would have replaced. Frank Jack Fletcher fought one more carrier battle, the Eastern Solomons, in August 1942, before a torpedo wound aboard the carrier Saratoga finally took him out of combat command. Despite the whispers, despite King's contempt, Nimitz inscribed a photograph to him in November of that year. The inscription, in Nimitz's own hand, read, "To Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, a fine fighting admiral and a splendid shipmate." Mark Mitcher, the man whose Hornet report had been carefully arranged to omit the worst, went on to command Task Force 58. The fast carrier striking force that broke the Japanese Navy across the entire Central Pacific in 1944 and 1945. He died of a heart attack in February 1947 at the age of 60. The men of Torpedo Squadron 8, the squadron that had been wiped out almost to the last man on the morning of June 4th, received the Presidential Unit Citation. The squadron was reconstituted with new pilots, new planes, and the same designation. It fought at Guadalcanal. It served until the end of the war. The 29 dead men of John Waldron's original squadron had not been wasted. Their sacrifice had given the American dive bombers the open sky they needed. George Gay, the only survivor, was rescued from the Pacific by a PBY Catalina 30 hours after he had bailed out. He recovered. He flew again. He lived until 1994. He spent the rest of his life telling the story of 15 men who had died so that someone else's bombs could find a target. These were the men Nimitz could save. There was one he could not. In 1953, Joseph Rochefort retired from the Navy as a captain. He had never received a single decoration for his code-breaking work during the war. He had spent the years after his transfer doing administrative duties so far from the war he had won that historians later struggled to even reconstruct the chronology. He never spoke publicly. He never gave interviews. He never wrote a book. In 1958, 16 years after the Battle of Midway, the man who had once been Joseph Rochefort's commanding officer, now retired Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, 73 years old, living quietly in Berkeley, California, picked up a fountain pen and wrote a 2-page letter to the Secretary of the Navy. The letter was handwritten. The handwriting was neat and steady. The letter requested, one more time, that Joseph Rochefort be awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for his work at Station Hypo. The letter was denied. The reason given was administrative. Awards for World War II actions have been closed. Chester Nimitz read the rejection. He folded it. He put it in his desk drawer. He died on February 20th, 1966, at the age of 80. He never raised the matter again. Joseph Rochefort died on July 20th, 1976. He was 76 years old. He had outlived Nimitz by 10 years. In all that time, he had never told the story. He had never explained what Washington had done to him. He had never asked anyone to remember. The cardboard sign that had once hung above his desk in the dungeon at Pearl Harbor had hung above every desk he had worked at in the 34 years that followed. We can accomplish anything in this world, provided no one cares who gets the credit. It was the only public statement Joseph Rochefort ever made about his own life. But the men who had served under him at Station Hypo had never forgotten. Donald Showers, the 23-year-old ensign who had worked beside Rochefort in the basement in 1942, had risen through the ranks. Captain, Commodore, Rear Admiral. For more than 4 decades, in committee meetings and recommendation letters and quiet conversations in Washington offices, he had pressed the case for Rochefort's recognition. He was turned down, again and again and again. In 1983, Showers tried one more time. The intelligence materials had been declassified. The full operational record was finally available. The case, with the documents in hand, was unanswerable. In May 1986, 44 years after the Battle of Midway, 10 years after Joseph Rochefort was buried, his family stood in the office of the Secretary of the Navy and received the Navy Distinguished Service Medal in his name. In the year 2000, President Bill Clinton awarded him posthumously the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor the United States can bestow. Captain Edward L. Beach, a decorated Pacific War submariner, the author of Run Silent, Run Deep, wrote the epitaph the United States Navy should have written for Joseph Rochefort in 1942, but did not. Rochefort had made more difference at a more important time than any naval officer in history. Chester Nimitz lies buried at Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Bruno, California. Raymond Spruance lies beside him. So does Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner. So does Admiral Charles Lockwood, 4 men who in the end won the largest war ever fought on water. They asked to be buried together. The Navy honored the request. They rest in a row in alphabetical order by no rule but their own. The question they answered, the question every commander asks after every battle, has not gone away. Someone made mistakes. Someone's judgment failed. 307 Americans died on a morning of overwhelming victory. Their families were not lying when they wrote letters demanding to know whose fault that was. The easiest thing any commander can do after the smoke clears is find a name to put on the loss. It satisfies Washington. It satisfies the newspapers. It satisfies the part of the human heart that needs the universe to be fair. Chester Nimitz, refused, not because the mistakes did not matter, not because the dead did not deserve an answer. He refused because 34 years earlier an old admiral had refused to destroy a careless young ensign on a mudbank in the Philippines. Because he understood, better than the men in Washington who had never lost a ship and never would, what the United States Navy needed. The men who make mistakes in battle are the same men you need for the next battle. Destroy them for what went wrong today, and you will have no one left to fight tomorrow. Washington punished the man who had made the victory possible. Chester Nimitz protected the men who had carried it out. 80 years after the smoke cleared over Midway, the United States Navy is still arguing about which one of them was right. But Joseph Rochefort never raised his voice, and Chester Nimitz never named a name. And the men they made, Raymond Spruance, Frank Jack Fletcher, Mark Mitcher, the pilots who flew the planes, and the sailors who crewed the ships, the men who lived to fight at Guadalcanal and Tarawa, and Leyte Gulf and Okinawa, those men won the rest of the war. Because someone, somewhere, had decided not to break them when they were down. Because somebody had been given a second chance once, and he never forgot.